Yoga Connection with Zorananda is a deep dive into the world of yoga, exploring the rich history of tradition, methodology, and practices both ancient and modern. Follow along as yoga is explored through solo episodes to guest interviews to understand its vast reach around the world. Hello and welcome to the Yoga Connection. My name is Zorananda, and we are on to another series. So we just wrapped up the Ashtanga Yoga series, and I say just wrapped up, but that was like a month ago or more. Sometimes these hiatuses are inevitable. I live a really busy life, and I'm in a new band now, and a lot of my attention and focus has been on doing shows and rehearsals and videos. But I have the time now to get into the next series, which is the traditional yogas. To me, I think it's really important as a practitioner and a teacher to understand where the yoga practice is coming from. And essentially, we have two ways to understand it. The first is your typical modern understanding of what the yogas are, when it comes to like studio yoga, where it's like hatha yoga, power yoga, yin yang yoga, restorative yoga, and whatever is coming out of that world. But in the historical and traditional sense, what yoga really is comes down to just a handful of practices that span hundreds if not thousands of years coming out of India. And so this episode is more so just more of a brief kind of explanation of what the series is going to be about and the different yogas that we're going to get into, where I'm not really going to go into what all the different yogas specifically are, because I'm going to save that for the individual episodes, obviously. But I'm just going to go into a breakdown of what the different yogas are and why they're important and what it means to look at the different practices and to ultimately choose what you're most aligned with. And that's really why there are these different kinds of yogas. It's because of how much diversity there is in people and humanity. Even in India 1,000 years ago, that there are all different kinds of people, even in one country, where you can't just take one ideology or one understanding and adapt it for everyone. And it's because it's not like a religion, right? When you look at Christianity or the Abrahamic religions, they're trying to just lump everybody into the one teaching. And what India has done is they saw the wisdom in actually branching out and having different forms. And within the forms, you have similar teachings, but you have different ways that you can express that teaching. So I've figured that there are 9 forms. There are the original kind of traditional forms, and then there are the newer forms. And so these 9 encapsulate what has come out of India. And then there are like the modern forms, which don't really come out of India per se. They are influenced by Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois and Iyengar to a large degree, but then the newer forms are more in title only rather than in actual like scripture and actual like foundational teachings that are coming from India originally. So the 4 main yogas are Hatha Yoga, which we would know the most of, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. And just to kind of briefly go through it, Hatha Yoga is our main kind of practice, our physical practice, breathing and pranayama practice, our meditation practice. Karma Yoga is the yoga of action. It's our kind of service to the world and how we show up and do things with society. Jnana Yoga is the yoga of wisdom. It has more to do with a scholarly side of things, reading scriptures, reading texts, and looking at the yoga in more of an intellectual way. And Bhakti Yoga, which is the yoga of devotion. And so that is the more artistic side of it, through sound and music and dancing, and to devote yourself to a kind of movement that is around the celebration of things. And then the newer yogas are Kundalini Yoga, Tantra Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, Laya Yoga, and Nidra Yoga. And it may seem that these other 5 ones are also old. I think out of them, like Tantra Yoga and Ashtanga Yoga, I just did a whole series on Ashtanga Yoga. It stems back pretty far, but it's a systematization of basically the first 4, right? Because you'll find the first 4 within the Ashtanga Yoga practice. You're going to have the Hatha Yoga practice through the asana and pranayama. You're going to have Jnana Yoga through the yamas and niyamas, and then through the meditation parts. Along with Karma Yoga, you have that in the yamas and niyamas, and then Bhakti Yoga, you have that through the yamas and niyamas. It's like Bhakti Yoga is in kind of in all of them, right? And so when you're looking at the newer ones, Kundalini Yoga, Tantra Yoga, Laya Yoga, and Nidra Yoga, these ones are kind of after the fact, in a sense of you have the systematization of yoga that is making its way from, the first 4 main yogas kind of building up in prominence in India. Then emerging out of that is Tantra Yoga, then Kundalini Yoga, and Laya Yoga, Nidra Yoga, and Ashtanga. And so Laya Yoga and Nidra Yoga are the interesting ones. I think Nidra Yoga is kind of like the newest of all of them, but then Laya Yoga is all about sound. It's like the sound of yoga, while Nidra Yoga is the sleep of yoga. And the 2 that are going to be the most familiar, I think, along with the 4 main ones, is Kundalini Yoga and Tantra Yoga, where Tantra is about ceremony. It's about getting in touch with the potency of our energies and using deities and using the goddesses to bring about worship in our life, so that within it's almost like the occult side of yoga, and where, the first 4 main ones are more so the societal, scientific, more psychological side of things, more physical side. Tantra is the more ceremonial, more ritualistic side of getting in touch with these deeper divinities within, the representation of deity. And then Kundalini Yoga is like more so along the lines of the energetics. And, typically Tantra and Kundalini kind of go together, where in a Kundalini practice, it's largely seated and it's a lot of just really rapid movement. Not so much like you would see in like a vinyasa movement of like ups and downs, but where you're doing a lot of like rapid back bending, or you're doing a lot of rapid breathing. And a lot of the time the practice is seated, where the Kundalini practice is kind of like the preparation for the sensitivity to the energy work, so that in the Tantra practice, you can channel that Kundalini energy into what your ritual is going to be. And, out of them, at least now, or, kind of always has been, Tantra is the taboo side of it. There's a lot of controversy around Tantra because of this kind of sexual implication of it, that it has this openness to indulging in your senses and indulging in pleasures. But when you really go into some of the really, really old accounts of Tantra practices, it's always around the venerating of divine deities. And in this case, it's around the 12 goddesses. So again, that's all stuff I'm going to get into when the time comes to actually do the episode on it. And so coming from the traditional side into the modern side, you know, a lot of people on social media right now are complaining about how watered down things have become. And they're just thinking that, you know, Western yoga has bastardized the practices. And the thing is whenever you have a really like old teaching that suddenly emerges into the greater society, it's almost inevitable that things are going to become generalized. And there's a benefit to that in a degree where most people are just operating generally in the mundane world, where their day-to-day life is very simple and there's really just normal rituals that are taking place. And so to introduce a yoga practice into their life where the initiation of it is really simple, it's just moving your body and doing some breath work, that is a really important seed that can grow into either like a little bush that produces a little bit of berries, and they can reap the berries from the bush, and it gives them, you know, some strength. It gives them connection to their breath. It gives them a peace of mind in knowing that they can have something in their routine and something in their schedule that can increase strength and increase flexibility. And the opportunity from there to take it into a deeper practice is whether or not you've planted a bush or a tree. And you might not know. And it's really going to be dependent on who you are as a person and your character, that some people are just naturally more in depth with themselves and they're naturally a lot more curious. And so that initial seed of yoga that they planted by going to a studio or maybe a workshop or something, that they synchronistically were handed a tree seed. And so that plant within them that they're growing, that is this like representation of yoga, is actually starting to grow and bear larger fruit. And then those larger fruit are going to be the different yogas and some more knowledge and some more initiation. And that tree that's growing inside them is just going to grow bigger and bigger. And then suddenly they can share that fruit. So with most people, they're just growing a little bush that they can harvest fruit for themselves. And the fruit obviously is a metaphor for, you know, the benefits of the yoga practice, where they're just getting enough of the benefits for themselves and they're happy and content with that. And that's all they'll do. Where there are some people that the benefits are so much that they can't help but want to share it, right? So this is something that's happened with me, that I just had an inclination towards more deeper dives into spiritual practices. And so it made sense for me to then embrace sharing what I know and what I've learned about the yogas. And there's something about the way that my mind works and the way that I am as a person that I'm able to study and grasp these things, and it's not so burdensome, it's not so complicated to me, that I can dive into each practice and get a lot of worth out of it and gain a lot of knowledge, and have a platform like this where I can then share my knowledge, right? And you know, when I have spoken to people about all of this, they're just amazed by how much I know. And in their mind, maybe they would have the capacity to be like, oh, I'm just going to like practice bhakti yoga and that's it. That's the yoga that I love. I love singing. I love chanting, and that's it. And then there's someone like me that's like, I'm going to get into Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga and Hatha Yoga and Kundalini and Tantra and Ashtanga and Lion. And it's like, I have just an infinite well of let's get into all of it, right? And I think the benefit of that is then I can take the time to kind of expound all this information that I've taken in. So the tricky thing might be considering where to start, because that might be overwhelming. And each one is very deep in and of itself. You know, when you're just thinking of Hatha Yoga by itself, you know, there's many episodes that I've done talking about the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. It is the Bible of the Hatha Yoga practice, right? And it's a big book. There's like hundreds and hundreds of pages, and there's so many techniques. There are so many practices, so many postures, breathing techniques, meditations. There's just so much. And so just looking at that and then considering all the other ones, it can seem kind of daunting to think about which one that you would prefer, which one that you would pick, and then explore that, because each one of these yogas can take a lifetime to explore. And there are kind of respective elders and teachers and masters that have really gone into depths in each one of these. And thinking about what to choose doesn't have to be rigid, where just because you choose one that you can't get into the others. And I've seen people do this, and I've seen the justification where and I see it the most in Bhakti Yoga, especially in the Kirtan and Bhajan community. So Kirtan and Bhajan essentially are devotional singing practices where you usually have 2 to 3 people who are leading, and then you have the crowd who are singing with, and it's usually call and response, and it's mantra and largely Sanskrit based, where the people leading the kirtan or the bhajan, they're playing some kind of instrument. If it's like traditional instruments from India, if it's the tabla, if it's the sitar, if it's any other kind of percussion instrument, or the bansari flute, that they're leading the chanting and the singing and the devotional practice, and then everyone else is singing along with them. And I find in that community is where I've run into people who don't do anything else, that they think to themselves that the other ones aren't really necessary, and maybe they have somewhat of a physical yoga practice. Maybe they do kind of go into the hatha side, but they won't go into the other yogas, and they think that like bhakti is all you need, and it's largely true to an extent, because bhakti is kind of underlining everything. You have devotion in everything that you're doing. But I just don't agree with the rigid side of things, where if you're going to go into one practice, you don't do any practice at all. And you'll also see that in the modern side of yoga too, especially the Iyengar and Vinyasa and Ashtanga yoga like series from Patabi Joyce, that the ones who are really strict in their practices, where they're practicing 2 to 3 hours every single day, that I find that they're really strict about what practice they do, and that they'll only do that. And you'll find that with like Bikram yoga practitioners who are really dedicated to Bikram yoga. They don't do any other practice. Same with Ashtanga, same with Iyengar. And to me, that's going to be beneficial as a practitioner when you are really diving into that series, when you're really diving into that practice. But I think it's healthy to go and experience other yogas. Like my teacher, he'll always say like all yoga is good yoga. And so to have this weird contradiction of seeking strength and flexibility and actually becoming a really physically flexible person, but then you're really rigid about your practice and you're not going to allow yourself to be open to experience other things, to see how other teachers are teaching things. And so even though I also am based in a particular practice in the Akanda Yoga series and the Akanda Yoga teachings, I still think that it's beneficial to look into other teachers and to find the wisdom of gurus and highly divine beings who can share something at a different angle, because you never know what kind of insights someone else will have. And if you're going to obsess about your teacher or, like this one way of doing things, their insights are always going to inform your bias. And because you have a really strong bias between that practice, inadvertently, you're going to be in a kind of loop within those teachings where going in and, listening to a lecture or a seminar or a workshop or something from another teacher, that I think there is this like little bit of fear that there might be a contradiction. And, I've had experiences with people kind of do this where they come in from a different teaching and they're sitting there just like groveling, and they're just upset that everything seems so different. I remember back in 2018, I was assisting in a yoga teacher training with my teacher. This is the second time I went to Rishikesh, and it was like just the 200-hour training. And we had this one student who was this Buddhist. He was a fairly advanced practitioner. He was able to do things that most people couldn't do in the class, especially for a 200-hour training. Like that's like the first training. And he would constantly challenge the head teachers, and he would constantly challenge Vishwaji and say, oh, why are you teaching this when it's actually this and this? And we can kind of see like, oh, okay, he like, obviously he has these strong biases because as the training went on, we started to learn more about him, and it finally came out that he was this like PhD candidate. He had studied Sanskrit. He's an ordained Buddhist monk, and he knew all this crazy stuff. And that like he was only doing the training because he was offered a teacher training position, and he needed a 200-hour training. Like, even though he was just so highly qualified, he was such a strong practitioner that he just needed a 200-hour, and he was kind of using this as a way to get certified so then he can go and teach teacher trainings on his own. But the beautiful thing is, because in the Akanda practice, we actually learn about all this stuff. We learn about all the different yogas. We learn how to embed them all into our practice. And since we were doing a lot of kirtans, we were doing a lot of like introspection and physical practice, and we were embodying, especially the first four, right? The Hatha Yoga, the Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, by going out and feeding people and cleaning, and the Bhakti Yoga by doing bhajans, that by the end of it, he ended up meeting someone in the training that they connected really well with, and they actually fell in love like in that training. And at the end of it, we were in a circle, and we were just talking about what the impact was of the training, and it got to him, and he started to cry, and he said, I came here with my own intention of getting this training so that I can just have the certification and go off on my own. He's like, but I didn't know how much this training would connect me to my heart, and that I would meet someone I'd fall in love with. And it was just so endearing, and it was so beautiful to have this man who was so rigid at first, and he was so strong in his bias of what he was trained in and what his teachers taught him, and all this stuff, that he finally allowed himself to be like cracked open and vulnerable, and to see that the 200 hour that he was participating in still had really like deeper merits in transformation, even though we weren't doing these crazy, intense advanced postures and techniques and stuff. Like it really humbled him in a new way. And I think that's the benefit of going to another teacher's class and experiencing the newness, so that your bias can be like checked, right? That's something that I try to keep in mind as much as I possibly can. And I'll even, I find myself slipping into the bias as well, that, I gravitate towards my teacher because of the experiences that I've had with him. But, the benefit of social media is that you can find all sorts of other teachers doing talks and doing lessons and stuff like that. And I always love finding those videos where suddenly, the algorithm will pop up this like teacher from India who's talking about something, and they don't even have to be that well known. It can be just some kind of like random person, and suddenly they're providing insights about their practice and about how like they do things. And then I'm like, oh man, I never thought of it that way. So what I can appreciate about what the like kind of ancient rishis and sadhus had done is they had the foresight to recognize that there will always be diversity in the world. And as tempting as it would be to monotheize this whole thing under just yoga and to say, you don't need anything else, you just need this one thing, it really did a great service to the world that we're in now to have all these different branches of yoga. And so that it's not ever feeling like you're going to be left out, right? So when you're looking at all that, and say you are someone that has some kind of physical disability and you're not able to do a really intense or really do any kind of physical yoga at all, maybe it's hard even doing breath work, but you're interested in learning something about it and wanting to get a good understanding of how this practice can be helpful, where something like Nidra yoga, just laying down or sitting up and with your eyes closed and listening to a kind of guided meditation that goes through scanning your body, that you can participate easily in just being still and letting the guidance take you in through your breath and in through your brain cycles, and going into this kind of like yoga of sleep, where then you can get the benefits of regulating your nervous system and your sleep cycles and your circadian rhythm through this kind of yoga practice. And, the same with bhakti yoga, that, maybe you just have a tough time. Maybe you have something neurological, and doing a strong physical practice or a physical practice at all just isn't available for you. That, sitting in a chair with a bunch of other people and singing and chanting and clapping and being present with this group who is just expressing itself beautifully and wholeheartedly, without judgment, without ridicule or anything, or without any kind of critical analysis, that then these practices are available. And I think that's the intention that's been carried through. That, at some point, not everybody is going to be able to do headstand or shoulder stand or like all the different vinyasa flows and everything, right? That there's this beautiful integration within the practice that allows different forms of the yogas to be available for you to experience, and ultimately streamlining towards the same goal, that each one of these practices is going, okay, well, here's the system of it, and it's going to look different in each school of thought, but it's all channeling towards the same thing, that you're getting in contact with something divine that there is inside of you and you are inside of it. And either you're doing it through a strong physical practice with pranayama and meditation, or it's through the service to others. There's a lot of people who do karma yoga and they have enlightening experiences through the synchronicity of being in service to community, being in service to your family and your friends, and that there's this potency to showing up and giving that can be enough, where you don't have to do anything else and you can be in service and you can be really fine-tuned in that and end up having these really beautiful experiences. You know, like I'll see these videos online of this guy who goes around finding homeless people and he says, "Hey, I'll help you out right now. We'll put you into housing and we'll get you cleaned up and we'll get you a job and everything. We'll pay for it all, but you have to fly out to Florida, and that's where everything is. We'll get you out of state so you can be out of this situation. Give me a day and I'll have it all set up." And it's like that level of just service, like wholeheartedly, selflessly. And, you know, he has a huge following online, and, you know, some people more than others, they need a little bit more attention and they need to get, into, what's the word? They need to go into recovery. And so there's one woman who he was like, "Yeah, for your level of recovery, we're going to have to put you into this facility." And it costs, like, for a month, it costs like 30 grand. Right. And to her, that's impossible, right? To a homeless person, coming up with 30 grand just on the spot. And he's like, "Don't worry about it. We're going to set up a GoFundMe. I have a lot of connections. We'll do this." In a week, they raised like $8,000. And he was like, "Yeah, we've got the money to start you off for a week. And then we're just going to go from there." And boom. And that whole month, they got her all the money, right? So to me, that is karma yoga. And whether you really want to call it that or not, it's the yoga of action. It's the unity of action, or bringing action into unity, where you are unifying the energies, right? So in that case, helping this person to go from being addicted to drugs and living on the streets to being brought into community, being brought into health, being brought into a better life. And so there's this unification that's happening within him and that person, and with a new community where she's being like unified into this whole new life where, she can actually get better and do something good for herself and for others. Right. And then it'll follow other people who he's helped, who have joined his team and are going out and like kind of recruiting, but like finding other homeless people. And it's just so beautiful to see, right? Like that is just so uplifting, and how amazing in this modern world, what the internet can do as a tool to spread this kind of goodness. And, that's why I'm convinced that yoga isn't just this Indian thing. I think yoga is an actual principle within this reality, and that whether we really know it or not, a lot of us are yogis in our own way, because we are devotional in what we do. So we are kind of bhakti yogis in our life, or like in that karma yoga example, that we're doing a lot of karma yoga. Even when it comes to like the hatha yoga, the physical practice, that even just through physical fitness and through athleticism, doing really intense athletic practices can be really similar to what yoga does. Yoga doesn't have to be this rigid thing where, oh, I roll out my mat, I sit on my mat, I do this thing, I do these poses, I do this thing, and that's my yoga practice. That there is a flow state that we are trying to achieve. And that flow state isn't dependent on the medium that we're using. So we can get into a flow state in any way physically. If it's running, that's what the runner's high is called. Or if we're playing a sport and we're just like really dialed in. And you see this in professional sports all the time, with soccer players, with hockey players, you name it, that suddenly they're dialed in and they're performing in a capacity that not everyone else can perform at. And you'll see this in yoga as well. And you can find that all throughout Instagram, where people post these videos of doing these crazy sequences and all this stuff. And it's really because they've dialed in the flow state. And dialing in that flow state, to me, is what yoga is. And it's fundamental in our life. And so you don't have to really do yoga to kind of become or be considered a yogi. You can be considered a yogi because you are dialed into that flow state. And music is a big one too. I find myself in these kind of pockets as a musician, where even if I'm with my band or my lead singer and we're just jamming and I'm just riffing, I'm really enjoying the moment and I'm really dialed in, and I'll just come up with this crazy riff out of nowhere. And it's not anything maybe we'll even use. It's just because what we're creating together and what we're playing together and what we're doing, I'm just really dialed into the moment and I'm in a flow state. To me, I think that's yoga, right? That's a unification. I'm unifying myself with something, and that something is like me, the space, the people I'm with, my instrument, and the vibe. And suddenly just all this music is coming out of me. And I see that through all of us. And it's the pinnacle of that is when we're on stage and we're playing together and we're all dialed in together and we see the crowd and they're all hyped together. And it's just all this one big cohesive blob of energy that we all are. To me, that is yoga. And so, this just goes back to, not allowing yourself to have really rigid biases of what it's supposed to look like. And I think for me, having a really specific yoga practice where I'm doing the kind of like step-by-step procedure of what a hatha yoga practice looks like, I think having that in my life as a foundation is then what is allowing me to have those yogic experiences just in my daily life. If it's even with my work, I show up in the office, I'm feeling good, I have a whole list of tasks to do, and I just crush that list of tasks. And, say between Monday and Friday, I'm like, okay, by Friday, I need to have all this work done. I need to get all my measures done. I need to get all my quotes done. I need to make sure my installers are set up. I need to make sure that I'm getting these jobs done. And then by Friday, I'm like, holy shit, I've checked off every single item on my list, and it just feels great. And that's how I know that through that week, I was just really dialed in and I was in a flow state at work. And it doesn't have to be so mystical either. The flow state is just, you're just focused and you're dialed in and you're getting the things done. And that's not going to happen all the time, right? There's plenty of times where I'm at work and I'm just scrolling on my phone, I'm on Reddit, and I'm just super distracted and I'm like, oh my God, I just don't want to work. But having the yoga practice, whatever form it is going to enable that flow state to come through more and more. So then you have this foundation. And, my teacher likes to say 1 hour of yoga a day is 23 hours of normal. And to me, what that means is that 1 hour of yoga has allowed you to go into a really specific flow state. And so that the rest of your day kind of piggybacks off of that. And so you don't really have to think of it. You don't really have to really be too cognizant of it. It's just now the foundation of that day is built on that flow state and that yogic state that you got into in your practice. And again, that doesn't have to really specifically mean that you have to do yoga. It can be really anything in the starting of your day that's going to allow you to really hyper focus on how to get into that flow state. And I think that's really the beautiful thing about yoga, and why I teach it and why I practice it. And, it's the one thing in my life where I can say it has its benefits and it's really important to do because I do it. I think it's really easy to talk about a habit, or maybe not a habit, but to talk about some kind of lifestyle change, but then never actually do that lifestyle change, where you see a video on YouTube or you see a video on the internet or something and you're like, oh, I really agree with that. And then you're talking to a friend at night and you're like, oh, have you ever tried doing this when you've never done it? Is kind of counterintuitive to being helpful, but that's just a side rant. Yeah, I think I'm kind of getting it to the point where I think I've spoken about all the things that I spoke about in this episode. Yeah, the coming episodes are going to be really, really interesting, I think, because they are just so rich in information, and each one has its own set of professionals and masters and scholars that have really dived into it. So yeah, I'm thinking that the first video is going to be on Hatha Yoga. I think that's a good start because that can go into a lot of the history of where yoga came from and what Hatha means, and how that ties into Shiva and I think it's Parvati, and the whole story of the beginning of yoga and why we get the names for the postures. And I think I when I was doing the asana part of the Ashtanga Yoga series, I did go into some of the origin of the names and why they're named that way. So I'll go a little bit deeper into that. And really focus on the science of things too, because, I'm a huge proponent in propounding that yoga is a science. It's not a religion. The religious aspects are coming from different parts of like Hinduism, and yoga is its own thing. And so there's this tendency to kind of blend the two, where when you look at deity worship and you look at venerating like Shiva or Vishnu or Brahma, or whoever, that it's that kind of worship is then taken and associated with yoga, even though those deities exist in yoga as well. But the utilization of the practices are scientific. And this is, kind of proven through all the texts, that the mantras that are used translate into these kind of weird universal truths, and I went into this with the Pranayama mantra and what that means in one of my last episodes. But I think that's it for me today. Thank you for listening, and check out my music, check out my band's music. My new band is Love Bomb, and we primarily play pop punk, kind of metalcore. So I'll have the link in the description to our new song Spiraling, which is amazing. It's such a kick-ass song. So check those out. Again, I have my teacher's videos and website and stuff like that in the description as well. I'm going to keep keeping that forward. And that's it. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy.